The two of them were found in the Hollow Fun, a stretch of bog and bramble 3 miles past the last fence post of Aldric Mossburn's land, by Aldric's own dog, a half-blind mutt named Soot who would not stop barking at a tangle of reeds until his master came to see why. What lay there was not a deer, not a wolf, not anything Aldric expected to find in the fun. It was 2 orcs, both of them folded into the mud like something had thrown them there and walked away. The larger one, a hulking shape, even collapsed, with a jaw like a shovel blade and one tusk snapped clean to a jagged stub, had a wound across his ribs that had gone the color of a bruised plum. The smaller one, slighter, with gray-green skin gone almost ashen, had 3 arrows still in her, 1 low in the hip, 2 in the shoulder and the meat of her arm. She was the one breathing. Barely. Aldric Mossburn was 61 years old, a widower, and a man who had spent 40 years of his life pulling stones out of unforgiving soil. He had buried a wife and outlived 2 sons to fever. He did not believe, particularly, that the universe owed him a reason to be kind. But he also did not believe, and this was the thing that the town of Pelos Reach would never understand about him, not in all the years after, that the universe needed to give him a reason at all. He went home, harnessed the cart, and came back. It took him most of the night to get them both onto the cart and the cart back along the fun track without losing a wheel in the mud. Soot rode the whole way pressed against Aldric's boot, ears flat, refusing to look at the cargo behind him. By the time Aldric had the 2 orcs laid out on the floor of his barn, he wasn't fool enough to bring them into the house. Not yet, not with arrows still in one of them. The eastern sky had gone the gray of wet ash. He had pulled arrows before. Not from orcs, but flesh was flesh, more or less, and an arrowhead didn't know the difference between a deer's hip and whatever passed for a hip on whatever this woman was. He worked by lantern light with a knife heated over a coal, with vinegar and what clean linen he had, and he talked the whole time, low and steady, the way he used to talk to spooked horses. "You're not going to thank me for this," he told her, working the second arrowhead free while she made a sound through her teeth that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite anything human either. "Wasn't expecting you to. Hold still now." She didn't understand him. Couldn't have, not in that state. But something in the tone of it seemed to reach her, because the third arrow came out without her trying to take his hand off at the wrist, which the first 2 nearly had. The big one, the male, didn't wake until past noon the next day. When he did, he came up off the straw like the barn was on fire, a sound coming out of him that put every hair on Aldric's arms on end. And for 3 full seconds Aldric was entirely sure he was about to die in his own barn with a half-stitched orc woman bleeding 3 feet away. Then the big one's eyes found the woman. Found her breathing. Found the clean linen wrapped tight around her shoulder. And something in him seemed to fold up and go quiet, the way a building fire goes quiet once the worst of the fuel is spent. He looked at Aldric for a long moment. "Garrick," he said finally, and put one huge hand flat against his own chest. Then he pointed, gently, impossibly gently for hands that size, at the woman. "Vashka." Aldric understood an introduction when he heard one. "Aldric," he said back, and didn't offer his hand, because he wasn't a fool, but he did nod, slow and deliberate, the way you'd nod to a man whose language you didn't speak, but whose meaning you understood well enough. It took 3 weeks for Vashka to walk without leaning on the barn wall, and another 2 before the color came back into her properly. In that time Garrick did not leave her side except to work, and he did work, from the second day onward, mucking the stalls and hauling stone, and splitting more firewood in an afternoon than Aldric's late sons could manage in a week, doing it without being asked, doing it like a man settling a debt he intended to pay down to the last coin. Pelos Reach noticed within 4 days. It was that kind of town, the kind where a stranger's cart passing through got remarked on for a week, where everyone knew whose chimney smoked late and whose didn't smoke at all. Garrick hauling a fence post past the tree line where the Hensley's boy could see him from the road was, in the town's accounting, the same as Aldric Mossburn announcing it from the chapel steps. The first visit came from Constable Verity Holt, a careful, tired-eyed woman who'd worn the badge 11 years and had buried more of the town's bad decisions than its good ones. She came alone, which Aldric took as a kindness, and stood at the edge of the yard with her hand resting near her belt, not on it, and asked him plainly what in the world he thought he was doing. "Found them half dead in the fun," Aldrich said. "Patched them up. That's the whole of it." That's not the whole of it, and you know it isn't, Holt said. Orcs raided the Calder farmstead 11 years back. You remember that. Everyone in 15 miles remembers that. These two didn't raid anybody. These two were left to die in a bog by somebody else's war, near as I can tell. Aldric kept his voice even. You want to arrest a man for pulling arrows out of somebody. Verity, you go on and do it. I'll come quiet. But I'm not putting them back out in that fun to finish dying just so the town can sleep easier. Holt looked past him, to where Garrick was stacking cordwood with a rhythm like a metronome, and to where Vashka sat on the porch step with Aldric's old hound's head in her lap, scratching behind its ears with a hand that, 3 weeks ago, had been pinned to a hip by an arrow. She didn't arrest him, but she didn't tell him he'd done right, either. She left without another word, and that silence said more than any warning could have. What followed was not a single dramatic turn but a slow tightening, the way a rope tightens around a wrist you don't notice until it's already cut deep. The general store stopped extending Aldric credit. Old Pell, who'd known Aldric's father, said it was nothing personal, just business sense, with things the way they are, and wouldn't meet his eyes while he said it. The Sunday congregation found new reasons not to save him a pew. Children who used to wave at his cart from the Henderson lane now ran inside when they saw him coming, not from fear of him exactly, but because their parents had taught them, in the specific, careful way parents teach children to be afraid of things, that the Mossburn farm was not a place to be near. Someone, Aldric never learned who, though he had his suspicions, left a dead crow nailed to his gatepost with a single word scratched into the wood beneath it, traitor. Garrick found it before Aldric did. He stood looking at it a long while, his jaw working, and then he pulled the nail free with 2 fingers, buried the bird at the tree-line with a kind of solemn care that surprised Aldric more than the dead bird itself had, and never spoke of it again. But Aldric noticed, after that Garrick stopped going anywhere near the road, started working only in the back fields, out of sight of anyone passing. You don't have to hide, Aldric told him one evening. The two of them and Vashka sharing a meal at the kitchen table, a thing that had become a quiet ritual, the 3 of them eating together while Soot worked the floor for scraps. Aldric had picked up perhaps 40 words of their tongue by then, enough to stumble through plain things. Garrick shook his head. Not hiding for me, he said, in the careful, deliberate way he'd begun forming the human words. Hiding so you keep less trouble. That's not your job to manage. Garrick said, simply, and went back to his food, and that was the end of the conversation, because there are some men, human, orc, or otherwise, who have decided a debt is owed and will not be talked out of paying it. The trouble, when it finally came to a head, came in autumn, on the night of the harvest bonfire, the one night a year when half of Pello's Reach gathered in the square with cider and music and let down whatever guard the rest of the year required of them. It started, as these things often do, with a boy who'd had too much watered cider and too little sense. Tomas Pell, the storekeeper's nephew, 17, and full of the particular bravery that only exists in front of an audience. He'd taken to standing near the bonfire telling anyone who'd listened that Mossburn's monsters had probably been sent ahead of a raiding party, that the old man was either a fool or a collaborator, and that somebody ought to go settle the matter before the whole town woke up with its throats cut. By the time the words had passed through enough mouths to reach the edge of the crowd, they'd become something else entirely. A rumor that the Orcs had already attacked someone, that blood had been spilled, that something had to be done tonight. A dozen men with torches and pitchforks and one old dueling pistol set off down the fun road before anyone with real authority knew it was happening. Verity Holt arrived at the Mossburn farm at the same moment the mob did, having run the whole way once she'd heard, and what she found there she would describe, years later, very differently than the version that first spread through town. Aldric stood on his own porch steps, between the mob and his door, an old hunting rifle held loose but ready in both hands, not raised, not aimed, just present, the way a man holds a tool he hopes he won't need. Behind him, in the doorway, Garrick stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, not advancing, not retreating, simply there, immovable as the doorframe itself. Vashka was nowhere to be seen, which Holt would later learn meant she'd gone out the back, circled wide through the orchard, and was at that moment standing quietly in the dark behind the mob's flank, not attacking, not even seen by most of them, just watching, ready, a fact that would unsettle several of those men for years after they learned of it. "Nobody in my house has hurt a soul in this town," Aldric said, and his voice didn't shake, though his hands, Holt noticed, were not quite steady. "Nobody's going to tonight either, lest you make me regret saying that." "You don't know what they are, old man," someone shouted from the crowd. Not Tomas, an older voice, one of the Calder cousins, and that name landed heavy, because everyone remembered the Calder farmstead. "You don't know what they'll do once they think it's safe." "I know exactly what they are," Aldrich said. "I've known for 4 months. They're the 2 people who've worked my fields without complaint, eaten at my table, and never once raised a hand to me or mine. That's what I know. What I don't know is what in the hell I'm looking at right now, coming up my road with torches over a rumor." It was Holt who broke the standoff, pushing through the crowd's edge, putting her own body between the torches and the porch, and demanding, in the flat, furious voice of a woman who'd had enough, that somebody tell her exactly who'd supposedly been attacked, by whom, and where. Nobody could answer her, because nobody had been attacked. There was no blood, no victim, no raiding party. Only a rumor that had grown legs somewhere between the bonfire and the 3rd torch lit, fattening on fear the way rumors always do when there's nothing solid to stop them. The mob didn't disperse all at once. Mobs rarely do. It thinned, man by man, as the absence of any actual emergency settled over them like cold water, until what was left was Tomas Pell, sobered considerably, standing alone in the road with a torch burning down toward his fingers and no earthly idea how he'd ended up there. That should have been the end of it. In a fairer telling, it would have been the mob shamed, the truth laid bare, the town forced to reckon with what it had nearly done over nothing. But Pello's reach did not, in the end, choose to reckon with anything. It chose instead to remember the night, not as the night a foolish rumor nearly got people killed, but as the night Aldric Mossburn. They stayed 3 more years on the Mossburn farm, long enough to rebuild the east fence, long enough for Vashka to teach Aldric, badly and with much laughter at his expense, the proper way to set a snare in the old orc fashion, long enough for the town's children to grow up half forgetting why their parents wouldn't speak to the old man on the hill, the way children eventually outgrow the fears handed down to them when no actual monster ever shows up to justify them. When Garrick and Vashka finally left, called back, in the end, to a clan reckoning neither of them spoke much about, and a debt of their own owed elsewhere, they left at dawn, the way they'd arrived, with little ceremony and less explanation. Vashka pressed something into Aldric's palm before she went, a small carved stone, orc make, worn smooth by handling, the kind of thing passed down rather than given. "For the door," she said, "so something of us stays in it." Aldric Mossburn lived another 9 years on that farm, mostly alone again, mostly forgotten by a town that never did circle back to apologize, not properly, not in any way that would have mattered. He nailed the stone above his door frame the day they left, and it stayed there the rest of his life. Through 2 more hard winters, through Verity Holt's eventual retirement, through the slow turning of a town that would, generations later, tell a softened, sentimental version of the story to children at the very same bonfire where it had once nearly gone so wrong, and never once mention how close it had actually come, or how little credit they'd ever given the old man who stood on his porch, and decided, alone, what kind of man he meant to be. But that's how it goes, more often than not. The town remembers the legend. It rarely remembers the cost of it, or who paid that cost, alone, on a porch, on an ordinary autumn night, for reasons that had nothing to do with the people he was protecting and everything to do with the man he refused to stop being.